All right, welcome to Book by Book for August 10th, 2022. We're going to be going through 1 Samuel chapters 23 through 26 this evening. And so we have a 3 short chapters and then 1 long chapter as we walk through this passage. And last week, or last time we were together, David escaped Saul and was on the run. He got Goliath's sword, and now he is heading toward, he went to Gath and was pretending to be crazy so that the king of Gath didn't execute him because his reputation was spreading. And so now he is going to be heading towards the cave of Adullam. So I think we said 22, but we're going to be in 23. Actually, did I say 22? I said 23. All right. Okay. So he's going to be in Keilah. So let's start in verse 1. When David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting at the threshing floors, he inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered him, go attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, here in Judah, we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? Once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. Their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. Now, Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. All right, so we'll pause there. This is an interesting dynamic because hears that Keilah is being attacked by the Philistines, and instead of just going and attacking, he inquires of the Lord. Now, why can you inquire of the Lord is not given to us at the beginning of this section, but it wasn't necessarily that he went and said, oh Lord, should I go to the end, attack the Philistines, and then the Lord spoke directly to him. Most likely what was happening was Ahimelech, the priest who escaped when the other priests were killed by the guy from, what's his name? He's not a good dude. Doeg the Edomite. When Doeg the Edomite killed the other priests because Saul believed they were in league with the Philistine or with David, Abiathar escaped. He took the ephod, and in the ephod were the Urim and the Thummim, which were part of the ways that the people would inquire of the Lord. And so this incident here is one more way that David is being established as the one through whom the Lord is working, because Saul does not have access to inquire of the Lord. David does. And so when he inquires of the Lord, and it's usually like a yes or no question that is asked, and the priest would reach behind the ephod, which is the chest plate for the priests. There was a little pouch where the Urim and the Thummim were kept, and the priest would reach in, and there was a white one and a black one, and he'd pull out the stone, and it would reveal what the will of the Lord. This is how they would inquire of the Lord. And so David does this with Abiathar, and gets a positive response. But the Philistines, remember, have thousands of soldiers, and David, maybe he had 400 when we started this venture. Maybe he's picked up a few more, but he doesn't have nearly the fighting force that the Philistines have. And so his soldiers are like, hey, we're in our home country, we're in Judah, and we're scared now. Like, if we're going to go to the border of Philistine territory in Keilah, then we are going to, we really need to know that God is on our side. And so he inquires again, and God says, yeah, absolutely. And they inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines, which, David is continuing to build his reputation as a military leader and somebody who is living in the favor of the Lord. And so there is a contrast between Saul and David that is continuing to build. And we pick up in the next section with Saul in verse 7. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has delivered him into my hands, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. And so the message here is that Saul is willing to lay siege to his own people to get David. I mean, this is the demented mind of Saul right now. And Saul called up all his forces for battle to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod. David said, Lord, God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? Lord God of Israel, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will. Again, David asked, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul? And the Lord said, they will. So David and his men, about 600 in number, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he did not go there. And so the part of the difficulty here is David is in the southern part of the kingdom of Israel, and this is in the tribe of Judah. And so most of the interactions that he's having with people in these chapters are his own tribe. And so he's asking, like, will my own tribe turn against me? And the people of Keilah have no defense against the people of Saul's army. Like they're not strong enough. And David is the enemy of Saul. And so it makes sense. Like, hey, we don't want to go to war with our own people. One person for peace seems like a good idea. And so David's like, are they going to turn me over? Yeah, they are. So they leave and they go from place to place. And in verse 14, David stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the hills and deserts of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. And so he's avoiding conflict with Saul by just living on the run. And this, I have not been to Israel, so I can't speak with having placed eyes on this terrain. But it's kind of like going to the Badlands. There's hills, there's caves, it's not great farming country, but there's a lot of different places to hide. And so when it's calling it a stronghold, it's not necessarily that there's all these walls that are protecting all these different places. The stronghold is that it is naturally fortified by geography, by topology, I should say. And so he's able to hide from place to place. And because there's not a lot of people there, he's also keeping the conflict away from populated spaces, which is, one of the ways that David is showing his concern for the people, whereas Saul is just coming through and saying, I'm going to just wipe out whoever I can find. This kind of warfare of like being on the run is something that, with a strong military force, you're like, well, clearly they should be able to find him. But I just want to remind us, it took us a long time to find Osama bin Laden. Like, this is what he was doing. He was going from place to place, hiding. And if you have the right network of caves and tunnels and all this different stuff, you can do a really good job hiding in rough terrain. And so, the U.S. military is like the strongest military that's ever walked this earth, and we couldn't find this one guy. So David is on the run from Saul, but he's going to have an opportunity to confront him here shortly. So verse 15, while David was in Horesh in the desert of Ziph, which is, I think, going to be my metal album name, The Desert of Ziph. My band name is Rhododendron, the most metal of flowers. When he was in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. Now, a couple weeks ago, it was last time we were together, I said, this is Jonathan and David. That was their last encounter. And I had overlooked this passage. And so I want to correct the record. This is the last time. But when they parted, they didn't probably think they would ever see each other again, because David was on the run from Jonathan's father. And so he comes here to bring him encouragement, to encourage him, to strengthen him in the Lord. And in this, he is saying, like, I know that you're going to be king. My father knows that you're going to be king. And so he's trying to remind David to not be afraid of Saul. And, Jonathan had so many opportunities to kill David and thereby win favor with his father, to secure his place in the Saul monarchy or dynasty. And he never took it, because his friendship with David was more valuable than power. And this truly is one of the most beautiful friendships in the Bible. As Jonathan is like, I just want to encourage my friend, support my friend. I recognize that God is working through him, and I want to be a part of what God is doing, not just what the earthly politics make possible and would benefit me. And so it's a pretty awesome example of sacrificial friendship. So in verse 19, the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horish on the hill of Hakilah, south of Jeshimon? Now, your majesty, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for giving him into your hands. So the Ziphites are trying to win favor with David, or with Saul, to say, like, hey, we know where he is. Come on down, get him. We'll hand him over. We have no allegiance to David. Saul replied, the Lord bless you for your concern for me. Go and get more information. Find out where David usually goes and who has seen him there. They tell me he is very crafty. Find out about all the hiding places he uses and come back to me with definite information. Then I will go with you. If he is in the area, I will track him down among all the clans of Judah. So they set out and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Maon, in the Arabah, south of Jeshimon. Saul and his men began the search, and when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. When Saul heard this, he went into the desert of Maon in pursuit of David. All right, so the chase is on, and they have informants, they're getting intel, and one of the questions Saul asks is, who has seen him there? And one of the answers to that question is his own son, Jonathan. And we don't know if that information got back to Saul, but he's curious. Who are his allies? Who are the people that trust David over me? And so that kind of intel is what Saul is looking for, and they're feeding all of that to Saul. Saul's on the hunt. Verse 26, Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side. So these mountains are not huge. So they're not like Rainier mountains. They're hills that like quick slope hills. And so they could probably hear each other on the other sides. Like that's the kind of tension that's happening here. Hurrying to get away from Saul, as Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them. A messenger came to Saul saying, come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land. Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. That is why they call this place Selah Hamnahelakoth. That one's a tough one. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. And so Saul is so close to capturing David, but then an actual conflict with an actual enemy flares up, and Saul recognizes, like, I need to be king. I need to go do king things and fight my actual enemies. And so the Lord spares him, spares David in this moment from Saul's forces. Which, there's times in human history where you look back and you can say, like, it's only by the hand of God that these forces were able to win. And a couple of weeks ago talked about the story of Dunkirk, and the providence of God in that situation of the German general like doing tank maintenance and stopping the advance onto the beaches of Dunkirk, giving the people of the UK time to gather their boats to come and rescue Allied forces off the beach. Like that's amazing. And like that's one of those times where like that is God's hand at work. I have a sneeze that I'm fighting here. There's another story again with this English Channel where the Spanish are coming up and they're going to wage war against the English. And and this is, with ships, and the Spanish had the stronger armada, but there was a massive storm that came through and wiped out the Spanish armada. And the people of England would say, like, this was God protecting us from our enemies. Now, whether or not we could make a claim that the English or the Spanish were greater representatives of the kingdom of God, that's not the point. They're just recognizing like this is not something that we could have planned. This is not something that we could have done on our own. This was the hand of God that came to benefit us. And so this is one of those moments where, yeah, the Philistines attacking is bad news, but for David, it's the greatest news he's ever had. Like, so, when we look around, even in our own lives, where we maybe almost got in that car accident, and the car like swerved away at just the right time, and it's like, if it wasn't for God, I probably would have been hit. Or you left a company. I don't know if this has ever happened. You left a company, and then that company got into some massive legal trouble, and you got out just in time. Or you go on and on and on. There's so many times if you look back, it's like, oh, there's God, there's God, there's God. And that's a lot of David's story in this section of 1 Samuel, is God intervening in a way that would preserve his life. And so, so David is now in En-Gedi, which is has some springs, has some water, but it is still in that rocky, hilly area. So verse 24:1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. Another good album name. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unannounced and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. All right, so the scene here, the men running from Saul, they go into a cave, hide way back in the cave, and Saul has to poop. That's what's happening here. He has to poop. And he goes in there because it's private, not knowing who also is in the cave. And like I don't know if you've ever been in a cave, but they're pretty echoey. And so like the guy is talking like, this is the moment. Like how did Saul not hear what was happening? If they could see him, and like I don't know if they have like really elaborate sign language that they had as military communication. I don't know what was up, but so David is like, okay, make the most of the opportunity, but instead of killing him, just cuts off a corner of his robe. And this robe would have probably, like the corner in particular, would have had like particular hems, like hem work. You sew, like I'm going to butcher these things, but particular things that would signify his authority as the king. Like it's not just a normal garment. And so that's what David is cutting off here. And then he crawls back and his men are like, is he dead? David's like, I got this. I got a little piece of his clothes. And he then feels terrible And we see, again, the contrast between Saul and David is David's honor is still recognized. While the Spirit of God has left Saul and is resting on David, David does not see it as his job to get vengeance, doesn't see it as his job to strike down Saul. He's trusting that the Lord will do that for him. And so he's conscience stricken, and he just eats him up. So Saul finishes what he's doing, and then he leaves. Verse 8, then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my lord the king. When Saul looked back behind him, David bowed to the ground, prostrated himself with his face to the ground. So he's humbling himself in front of his enemy. Like he's showing like a honor, but also like making himself weak in front of him. Like that's, if you've ever laid face down on the ground, there's not a lot you can do. And so he is humbling himself there. He said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day, the Lord, this day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. And so David is essentially saying, like, what's the deal? Like you are people are saying, I want to kill you. Here I had the opportunity and I didn't. Who are you going to believe? And David knows that all of Saul's angst is coming from himself. It's coming from within Saul. There is nothing that David has done that would indicate that he wants to take Saul down at all. And so this is what he is explaining here. There's no wrongdoing, and I will let the Lord judge between you and me. And how much greater would that judgment be if we would be willing to let go of the conflict and the beef that we hold between other people, to be able to say, like, you know what, you can forgive somebody. It doesn't mean you have to be their best friend. And just like, if somebody has wronged you, it's to say, like, all right, I'm not going to seek vengeance. I'm going to let the Lord do the work of justice. And I'm going to do what I can to be an honorable person in the meantime. And I mean, we've all probably had family, friends, and different relationships that have gone through these kinds of conflicts that just fester and build and build and build. And it's never worth it. And so when we read this kind of a passage, I would encourage us to remember, like, I'm going to let the Lord judge. I don't have to be right. I don't have to tell them that they're right, but I'm not going to go out of my way to bring harm to the other person. And so he continues, against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog, a flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. So again, David is saying, like, you're powerful. I'm a flea. You're big and strong. I'm a dead dog. Like, I got nothing compared to what you have. And yet you bring the whole force of the army of Israel against me. And I'm going to just trust that the Lord will vindicate me. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? And I bet David at that point was just like, for real? Who do you think has been talking to you? And he wept aloud. You are more righteous than I. He said, you have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hand, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So here we see Saul acknowledging, like, yeah, I know you're going to be king, not me. But please just don't kill off my descendants, which would have been fairly normal if, like, with a switch between dynasties, because descendants will want to have a claim for the throne. And we'll see that because David will do the best he can to not kill off Saul's descendants. And we will see that when he is in conflict in the future, those who remain, there is some conflict between Saul's household and the household of David later on. But David is going to do the honorable thing. And he gives an oath and he keeps the oath. For Saul, an oath means nothing. I mean, we've already said, like, I'm not going to try to kill you, David. And then a couple weeks later, tries to kill him twice. So oath means nothing to Saul, but David, it means something. And so David's life is spared again. Saul goes home. And then in verse 25:1, we get an important passage. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. And so Samuel, who is the kingmaker, right? God calls him to anoint Saul. God called him to anoint David. He has led the nation spiritually and as a judge for years and years and years before the kings took over, and he died. And this is a significant moment for the entire nation because they knew the influence of Samuel. And so all Israel comes together, and it could even be that David came. This could have been a moment of peace, a truce to honor Samuel, who was such a significant person in everybody's lives. It's not unlike when a politician dies in our country. Like, people from all parties will say nice things about this person. And like when John McCain died, he's the last one I can really remember, where like the whole country kind of stopped, and like he had his service in Arizona, and he had the Union State in Washington. Like, Democrats, Republicans, people were all saying, like, yeah, he served his country to the best of his ability and went above and beyond as a prisoner of war. And they said all these wonderful things. And, it's that kind of thing that could be happening here with Samuel. The question then that this kind of a passage brings up then is like, well, then who wrote 1 Samuel? Because there's more of this book and he's dead. So let's keep in mind. And 2 Samuel, there's this whole sequel that Samuel didn't have any hands on. And so there's a tradition of historical writing and capturing these stories that maybe Samuel started, or maybe somebody else wrote down, and Samuel is just called for Samuel because he is the one the Lord uses to instigate all these things that happen. So we don't really know who wrote 1 Samuel, but we know that Samuel did not finish it. So, and that's okay. That's okay. Sometimes people like tie the names of the books to the authority of the book. Like, if this person wrote it all and that's why it has authority, it's like that doesn't mean anything. Like, we don't know who wrote Chronicles, but we still hold it with authority. And like the same can be true with Samuel. Like, we don't have to say like, well, he had to write the whole thing, because he didn't. So it's okay. It's okay. The Lord speaks and inspires the writers of Scripture to capture these stories for our benefit. We don't need to know who wrote every single word. So, and if that creates more confusion, then send me an email. Verse 2, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. And so we are introduced here to two contrasting figures as well, Nabal and Abigail. Abigail is wise, gentle. Nabal is everything else. His name means foolish. And so it's probably not the name his mom gave him. It's probably, or his dad gave him. It's probably a name that people assigned to him later on, because his activity of his behavior of being mean and surly. These are all like, this is not a good way to influence people, but he had a lot of stuff. He was a wealthy person. So he probably also then thought, well, I'm big and important because I'm rich. I'm wealthy. I can do what I want. I can get away with it. So we're getting these contrasts here. This book is full of contrasts. And so it would be a good study sometime just to go through and see like who's being contrasted with who. So we have contrasts with Eli and Samuel, contrast with David and Saul, contrast with Saul, Jonathan and Samuel, David and his sons later. And now we have this tiny contrast between Abigail and her husband, Nabal. While David was, so this is also the tribe of Judah. These are David's clansmen, his tribesmen. So like they're cousins essentially. So this is another important piece here because we're going to get into some conflict between his own tribe. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, go to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, long life to you, good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now hear that it is sheep shearing time when your shepherds were with us. We did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. So he's sending his men to say, hey, we've been very respectful to your property. You know, roving bands of mercenaries, they're not usually that way. Like if we wanted something, we could have taken it, but we didn't. So it almost reads like a mob shakedown. Like honestly, like the first time I was reading through this, I was like, this feels kind of icky. It's like a real good flock you got here. Shame if somebody came and sheared it all. But that's not his intention. He's saying like, look, we're clansmen. Would you look out for us? Would you provide for anything to help us survive? Because we're on the run. You know, Saul is after us. And so that's the request here. He's asking for some help and assistance. So when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal his message in David's name, and they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to men coming from who knows where? Well, Nabal knows where. He knows David. He knows who he is. These are all rhetorical questions. But the main thing is like, hey, if I give you something because you are on the run from your master, the king, what kind of message does that send to my servants? What kind of message does that send to the people who I'm responsible for? Will they then run away from me and take things that are mine? And so Nabal is acting very, very, protective, but also like trying to keep David in his place. Like, you are just a servant to the king. And Nabal himself, he probably feels like the king of his region. He's the man in power. David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, each of you strap on your sword. So they did. And David strapped on his as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us. And the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us the whole time, and we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. All right, so we have David getting the response from his men saying like, Nabal's a jerk, and David's like, get your swords, going to war with Nabal. And at the same time, Abigail's getting a message from Nabal's servant saying like, Nabal's an idiot. Like, these folks were so good to us, and if we don't intervene right now, then this is going to be bad news for everybody. And so Abigail, who we were told in the first section is intelligent and beautiful, she is seeing the foolishness of her husband and jumps in to intervene. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, and 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on the donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into the mountain ravine where David and his men were descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." And so David is hot. He's like, this guy, I'm getting my vengeance now, which is just interesting because just a few sections earlier, he's like, "I will let the Lord judge between you and me." And now David is like, "I'm going to judge right now what's happening between me and Nabal." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention to my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming you, harming my lord, be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my lord, be given to the men who follow you." And so she's saying, like, yeah, my husband's an idiot. So please don't listen to him. He doesn't speak for everybody, even though he thinks he speaks for everybody. Keep reading, Jason. "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. By the lives of your enemies, he will hurl away but the lives of your enemies, he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling." So she's even referring back to David's victory here, like the stone you threw at Goliath. Like God is, going to orchestrate things in such a way, like your enemies will be like that stone that's just going to go away. It'll just fly away. So don't worry about those people. When the Lord had fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and he appoints him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. So she's trying to say, like, killing all the people in Nabal's household, that it's just needless. You're mad at one person who insulted you, but he's an idiot. And everybody knows he's a fool. And I don't know why. I mean, Abigail is married to him, and she sees right through his foolishness. And so she's able to speak directly and honestly. And so she's saying, like, don't throw away your good character in your anger. And it's an important lesson, because anger makes people stupid. And for David here, he's about to do something very dumb, like fighting his own tribe would be bad. It would be, as the kids say, a bad look. And here he goes on his way with his 400 men, ready to kill people. And this woman comes and says, "No, don't do it." David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet you, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." So he sees, like, oh, wow, you have redirected the whole story. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So crisis averted. But the story's not done. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of the king. And David had said in his note, "Hey, it's a festive time. We'd like to participate in festivities," because sheep shearing was a celebration time for the different people. And David would have known that because he's a shepherd. And so, like, sheep shearing time, like, there's a lot of shared communal feasting happening. And David's like, let me just be a part of this. And so Nabal said no. Instead, Nabal is home throwing a rager and he's throwing a party like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So he had like a heart attack, fell into a coma for like 10 days. Just on hearing the news that Abigail gave David all of this stuff. And it was a lot. It was a lot of stuff that she gave him. And like that news, like shocked him into a place where like, maybe he thought like, I'm never going to recover from this. Like, I'm never going to be able to make it. Like, why did you do this? And he started panicking, had a heart attack. 10 days later, he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Like, I will let the Lord judge between you and me is one of those things where it's like, great. In this story, like David's like, that worked out wonderfully. It's so much easier. Like, I could have gone and killed a bunch of people, but there's just the one guy. Look what God's a lot more efficient than David. It's great. Then David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. Even better. Everything's coming up David. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to take you to become his wife." So she bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "I am your servant, and I'm ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servant." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Galim. And so David, somewhere along the way, he picked up this wife, Ahinoam. We don't really know how that happened, but now he is going to have a second wife. And he has a third wife, Michal, but Saul probably forced a divorce from David when she tried to spare his life. And so like forced a divorce and then remarried her right away so that David would not be able to have any kind of claim to the family of Saul. And so so now he has these 2 wives, and in the ancient world, marrying wives was more often than not a political arrangement. And so he's trying to build a network of families that will support him. And so having a wife from Judah is important. Having a wife from Jezreel, which I believe is Ephraim, another tribe, is important. And so this is part of his political networking, as well as here it seems like a actual like love for Abigail. But there's also, as I was researching this passage, there's an indication that he's kind of working as a kinsman redeemer. Because as we remember Ruth, Boaz married Ruth as a way of securing the family line for Naomi's husband. And so Naomi actually ends up adopting Ruth's child as her own, essentially, to say like, now he's grafted into our line. And so the reason that we say this is because we only ever read about one child that Abigail and David have, and that child is never in any kind of conversation about becoming a king. And so it seems like this is, even though Nabal was a fool, he still had inheritance rights. And so the son that David and Abigail had assumed Nabal's possessions. And so even though we don't know how close David really was to the family, but he's stepping in a way to secure the inheritance for Nabal's family. And so it's an interesting story. It's not just David just liked to have a bunch of wives. He's also like trying to fulfill, like, let's make sure that people have the inheritance that God promised to them, which is an interesting way to understand this whole event. Also, this speech from Abigail is the longest speech by any woman in the Old Testament. It's 153 words in Hebrew. And so that's something to note as well. Most of the long speeches in the Bible are from men. We have Deborah's song is also long. Miriam has a long song. But this is the only like speech that is this long, like imploring with a man to change his mind, and it proves effective. And so, super interesting story. David ready to kill some people, and Abigail totally intervening, changing the narrative, but God's justice is still fulfilled as Nabal falls into a coma and dies. So pretty amazing story. All right. Let me see. All right. That's everything from chapter 5. All right. One more chapter, chapter 26. Let's jump to it. Verse 1. The Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding on the hill of Hakilah, which faces Jeshimon?" So here they are again giving Saul info, like, "Hey, we know where he is. Come get him." So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with the 3,000 select Israelite troops to search there for David. Saul made his camp beside the road on a hill of Hakilah facing Jeshimon, but David stayed in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out his scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of his army, had laid down. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. David then asked Ahimelech, the Hittite, and Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, "Who will go down in the camp with me to Saul?" "I'll go with you," said Abishai. Abishai is always ready to throw down. Like, that's part of his personality. Every time we meet him, he's like, "I'm ready to kill somebody." So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and his soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice." And this spear is probably the very same spear that Saul threw at David multiple times. And it's probably not just a weapon of war as much as it's a symbol of his authority. So like a scepter, that's also a spear. And so everywhere he goes, he's bringing it with him. And so David recognized it right away. Abishai's like, let me do this for you. I don't want you, because earlier, remember, David said, "I'm not going to touch my Lord's anointed." And Abishai's like, "Well, then let me. I'll do that." And it's like, and I love the detail here. "I won't strike him twice." Like, one hit'll do. I'll get him in one. Like, that's a ton of confidence from Abishai. Have you guys seen Tombstone? Oh man, let's just pull that up real quick. Tombstone is a Western, and Doc Holliday's in it, and he's, it's Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday at the OK Corral, and it's just a really great story. But Doc Holliday is, wherever Wyatt is, Doc is there, and he's Wyatt Earp's Abishai, who's like, look, Wyatt Earp's trying to become a lawman and a respectable person, and Doc Holliday's like, "I'm not worried about that." And so he like this, and these are true stories. These are real people in our country's history, and he's willing to like take people out for Wyatt because like he's like, I respect you, and so this is kind of that same vibe. Like, I'll get him in one. Anyway, so David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head and let's go." So he's doing the same kind of thing, like just show him how close we were. So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. And God is clearly on David's side here. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" So this is probably like dawn. It's still not, you can't really see what's going on as the sun is rising. David said, you're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men must die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head? And so David is calling out Abner, saying, you're terrible at your job. Your job is to protect the king. And I was right there and you were asleep. You're terrible at this. Now, Abner didn't know that the Lord had put him into a deep sleep. And maybe David didn't know that the Lord had put him into a deep sleep. But whatever it is, Abner should not have been asleep. And David is calling him out. So Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king." And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? And what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's words. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, people have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, 'Go serve other gods.' Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The King of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountains." And so part of David's complaint here is, you are pushing me away from the land that God has given me. Because David is also a part of the inheritance. There is land in Israel that is David's land. And Saul's pursuit of him means that he can't live a peaceful life. But what's more is pushing him away from the land is also pushing him away from his relationship with God. Because if he's going into the lands of the pagans, like if he has to say, I'm just going to have to go live with the Philistines, then the temptation will be to worship the gods of the Philistines. And so David's complaint here is not just a military complaint. It's not just a political complaint. It's also a spiritual complaint that you are trying to get in between me and my relationship with the Lord. Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you consider my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong." And David's not falling for this again. Here's the king's spear," David answered. "Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble." Then Saul said to David, "May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." So David went on his way and Saul returned home. So another instance where David had the opportunity to kill Saul and he didn't take it. But again, showed the corruption of Saul, showed the ineptitude of Abner. And Abner is going to be a fun character as we continue on through the history with David. Abner and Joab are going to have beef and it's going to be a mess. But yeah, I mean, time and again, the Lord is protecting David. And he even sends a woman, which is a majorly controversial thing for a woman to try to correct a man in the ancient world. And here, David listens to her and softens his heart, and God blesses him even more. And so, yeah, so that's our section for tonight. Next week, we'll wrap up 1 Samuel. We should finish up the next few chapters because it ends with 31. So we'll do 27 through 31. But yeah, any questions for tonight from what we read, whether online or in person? No. It is a fun collection of stories. So yeah, but I do love a Western. And this is one of those passages where it's like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as they're just running. And there's like that scene where it's like they have to jump into the river and they're like, we're going to die in the river. And I can't remember who says it, but one of them's like, the fall is what's going to kill you. Like there's a lot of like, we're just going to have to trust the Lord with this next step here in these passages. And God continues to protect David all along the way. So, yeah, but if there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and wrap up tonight, and we will be back next week. So God bless everyone, and have a good week.
You too.
Bye.